I dropped him off at the daycare on the second floor that morning, kissed his little forehead and promised I would see him at lunchtime, never knowing that those would be the last words I would ever speak to my grandson, never imagining that the building where I had worked for 23 years would become his grave, never dreaming that April 19th, 1995 would be the day my world exploded along with everything I thought I could count on in this life. My name is Helen Catherine Morrison. I am 78 years old now, and I was one of the survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing that took the life of my 3-year-old grandson Timothy James Morrison, my daughter's little boy who was supposed to be safe in the America's Kids Daycare Center, while I worked 3 floors above him in the Social Security Administration office. Both of us in the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on what should have been just another ordinary Wednesday morning. If you're watching this and you've ever experienced sudden, devastating loss, please comment below and tell me where you're calling from, because I want you to know that the pain I'm about to share with you is something that changes you forever, something that divides your life into before and after. Something that teaches you how quickly everything you love can be taken away without warning, without reason, without any chance to say goodbye. Little Timothy was my heart, my sunshine, my reason for getting up every morning since my daughter Sarah had asked me to watch him while she finished nursing school, since my husband Robert had passed away 2 years earlier, and I needed something to fill the enormous emptiness that retirement and widowhood had left in my life, since that beautiful little boy with his dark curls and bright blue eyes and infectious giggle had moved into my house and turned it back into a home filled with laughter and chaos and the particular joy that comes from loving a child completely and being loved in return. If you have grandchildren or small children in your life, please share their ages in the comments below, because I want you to hold them a little tighter tonight, appreciate them a little more tomorrow. Never take for granted the precious gift of their presence in your world. Timothy had been living with me for 8 months when the bombing happened, 8 months of bedtime stories and morning cartoons, of teaching him to tie his shoes and helping him learn his letters, of watching him discover the world with the wonder and curiosity that only 3-year-olds possess. The ability to find magic in puddles and butterflies and the way sunlight streams through windows. The capacity to love without reservation, to trust without question, to believe that the adults in his life would always keep him safe, would always protect him from harm, would always be there when he needed them most. The arrangement worked perfectly for both of us, because the federal building had an excellent daycare center on the 2nd floor, America's Kids, which had been specifically designed to serve the children of federal employees. A bright, cheerful space with caring teachers and educational programs and all the safety measures you would expect from a facility inside a government building. A place that felt as secure as anywhere could possibly be. A place where I never worried about Timothy's well-being, because I was literally 3 floors above him, because I could visit him during my lunch break, because if anything ever went wrong, I would be right there to take care of him, to comfort him, to make sure he was okay. That Wednesday morning started like all our Wednesday mornings for the past 8 months, with Timothy waking up early and climbing into my bed for cuddles, with me making his favorite breakfast of pancakes cut into dinosaur shapes while he sat at the kitchen table in his pajamas, telling me about the dreams he had during the night, stories that were half memory and half imagination, filled with talking animals and flying cars and adventures that made perfect sense to a 3-year-old. Mind but sounded like pure magic to his grandmother who had forgotten what it was like to believe that anything was possible, that the world was full of wonder rather than danger, that tomorrow would always come and would always be better than today. He was excited that morning because it was show and tell day at the daycare, and he had chosen to bring his favorite stuffed elephant. a gray and pink plush toy named Peanut that had been his constant companion since he was a baby, that he slept with every night and carried with him whenever we went anywhere new or potentially scary, that represented comfort and security and the unconditional love that exists between a child and his most treasured possession. He had practiced his show-and-tell presentation with me the night before, explaining to his imaginary classmates why Peanut was special, how Peanut helped him feel brave when he was scared, how Peanut had traveled with him from his mommy's house to grandma's house and had helped him feel at home in his new bedroom. His earnest little voice making me smile and my heart swell with pride at his confidence, his articulation, his natural ability to express himself. The drive to the Federal Building that morning was filled with Timothy's chatter about his plans for the day, about the games he wanted to play with his friends, about the story his teacher, Mrs. Johnson, had promised to read during circle time, about whether I would be able to come down and have lunch with him like I did most days, our special tradition that broke up my work day and gave both of us something to look forward to, a chance to see each other's faces and share whatever excitement or triumph or minor crisis had occurred during our morning apart. He was buckled into his car seat in the back of my sedan, clutching Peanut and singing along to the children's music tape we always played during our commute, his sweet little voice making even the most repetitive songs sound like masterpieces, filling the car with joy and innocence and the particular happiness that comes from being 3 years old and having your whole life ahead of you, unlimited possibilities, unlimited time, unlimited love waiting to be discovered and experienced and shared. We arrived at the Federal Building around 8:15 that morning, our usual time, early enough for me to get Timothy settled in the daycare before starting my workday at 9 o'clock. Late enough that the morning rush had died down and the elevators weren't too crowded. The perfect timing that we had developed over months of practice. Months of figuring out the rhythm that worked best for both of us. The routine that made our unconventional living arrangement feel natural and sustainable and filled with love rather than obligation. Timothy held my hand as we walked from the parking lot to the building entrance, his little legs working hard to keep up with my longer stride, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders, Peanut tucked securely under his free arm. Everything about him radiating health and happiness and the absolute trust that 3-year-olds have in the adults who care for them, the belief that we will always keep them safe, always make the right decisions, always be there when they need us most. The security guards at the entrance knew both of us by name, had watched Timothy grow more confident and outgoing over the 8 months he had been coming to the daycare, had witnessed our morning routine and afternoon pickup countless times, had become part of our extended family in the way that happens when you share space and time and casual conversations with people who see you at your most ordinary, most human, most real. Officer Martinez always had a piece of candy for Timothy. Officer Jackson always asked about his latest artwork or playground adventures, and both men treated him with the gentle kindness that comes from understanding how precious children are, how important it is to make them feel welcome and valued and safe in a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming and confusing and much too big for little people to navigate alone. We took the elevator to the second floor as we did every morning, Timothy pressing the button because he was tall enough now to reach it by himself. A small achievement that filled him with pride and made him feel like a big boy, independent and capable and growing up in all the ways that 3-year-olds measure maturity. Ways that seem trivial to adults, but represent enormous milestones to children who are learning to navigate their expanding world, learning to trust their own abilities, learning to take small steps toward the independence that will eventually carry them through life. The elevator ride was short, just a few seconds, but Timothy always used that time to tell me something important, some observation or question or plan that had just occurred to him. his little voice echoing in the enclosed space as he shared whatever was on his mind, his thoughts jumping from topic to topic with the delightful randomness that characterizes the way children think and communicate and experience the world around them. The daycare center was already bustling with activity when we arrived. Other parents dropping off their children, teachers greeting everyone with warm smiles and genuine enthusiasm. The kind of welcoming atmosphere that made me feel confident about leaving Timothy there every day, that reassured me that he was not just being watched but truly cared for, not just supervised but actually nurtured, not just kept safe but encouraged to learn and grow and develop into the amazing person I could already see he was becoming. Mrs. Johnson, his favorite teacher, was there to greet us as always, a woman in her 40s with infinite patience and genuine love for the children in her care, who knew each child's personality and needs and fears and joys, who made every parent feel like their child was special, was valued, was getting the individual attention and care they deserved. Timothy ran to Mrs. Johnson with his characteristic enthusiasm, eager to show her Peanut and explain his show-and-tell presentation, his excitement bubbling over as he described what he planned to say, how he planned to demonstrate Peanut's special qualities, how he hoped his friends would understand why this particular stuffed animal meant so much to him, why Peanut deserved their attention and admiration, and maybe even their envy, because what 3-year-old wouldn't want a friend as loyal and comforting and consistently available as Peanut had always been for Timothy. Mrs. Johnson listened with the kind of focused attention that good teachers give to children, asking questions and making observations that showed she was truly interested in what Timothy had to say, that she understood how important this moment was to him, how much his confidence and self-esteem depended on feeling heard and valued and taken seriously by the adults in his life. I kissed Timothy goodbye at 9:15 that morning, 15 minutes before my workday officially started, giving myself enough time to get settled at my desk and review my schedule for the day, enough time to transition from grandmother mode to professional mode, though the truth was that being Timothy's caregiver had become so central to my identity that I never really stopped thinking about him, never really stopped being aware of his presence 3 floors below me, never really stopped feeling grateful for the opportunity to be such an important part of his daily life, such a significant influence on his development, such a consistent source of love and stability during these crucial early years when children form their basic understanding of how the world works, whether it's safe, whether they're valued, whether the adults who claim to love them can be trusted to keep their promises. My workday in the Social Security Administration office on the 5th floor was busy but routine, filled with the kind of paperwork and phone calls and client meetings that had made up my professional life for 23 years, the familiar rhythm of government work that could be frustrating and rewarding in equal measure, that provided steady employment and good benefits and the satisfaction of helping people navigate complex systems and access services they needed and deserved. I had always taken pride in my work, in my ability to explain complicated regulations in simple terms, to advocate for clients who were confused or intimidated by the bureaucracy, to use my experience and knowledge to make a positive difference in people's lives, even if that difference was sometimes small, sometimes administrative, sometimes invisible to anyone but the person I was helping and me. That morning I was working on disability claims, reviewing medical records and financial information, trying to determine whether applicants met the criteria for benefits, whether their conditions were severe enough to qualify for assistance, whether the documentation supported their claims for help. It was detailed work that required concentration and careful attention to paperwork, the kind of work that could absorb your complete focus if you let it. that could make hours pass without you realizing it, that could create a sense of accomplishment when you were able to approve a claim for someone who truly needed help, who had been struggling to make ends meet while dealing with serious health problems, who deserved support from the system they had paid into during their working years. I was scheduled to have lunch with Timothy at 12:30, our usual time, when the daycare served lunch to the children and I could take my break and spend 30 minutes with him, hearing about his morning activities, meeting any new friends he had made, checking to see how his show and tell presentation had gone, whether he had felt confident and proud sharing peanut with his classmates, whether they had asked good questions and shown appropriate appreciation for his beloved elephant, whether the experience had been positive and confidence-building, or whether he needed extra reassurance and support from his grandmother, who loved him more than life itself. At 9:02 that morning, while I was reviewing a disability claim for a construction worker who had injured his back and couldn't return to his physically demanding job, while Timothy was probably participating in morning circle time with Mrs. Johnson and his classmates, while hundreds of other federal employees were beginning their workday in offices throughout the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, while America's kids' daycare was filled with the laughter and chatter of children who were safe and loved and completely unaware that anything dangerous could ever happen to them in this secure government building, Timothy McVeigh's truck bomb exploded in the street below, turning an ordinary Wednesday morning into the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in American history, destroying lives and families and communities, and the fundamental sense of security that allows parents to leave their children in daycare centers, that allows grandmothers to work 3 floors above their grandchildren without constant worry, that allows all of us to assume that buildings will remain standing, that floors will remain floors, that ceilings will remain ceilings, that the physical world around us is stable and predictable and safe. The explosion happened at 9:02 exactly, though I didn't know the time until much later, until investigators had pieced together the timeline, until the exact moment of impact had been documented and recorded and made part of the official record of what happened that day, part of the evidence that would eventually convict Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, part of the story that would be told and retold in news reports and documentaries and memorial services, part of the history that would define Oklahoma City for decades to come, that would change how Americans think about domestic terrorism, about the vulnerability of government buildings, about the price of political extremism and the innocent people who pay that price with their lives. But in that moment, at 9:02 on April 19th, 1995, I didn't think about time or history or terrorism or politics or anything except the fact that the world had suddenly exploded around me, that the floor beneath my desk was shaking like an earthquake, that the windows in my office were shattering, that the ceiling tiles were falling like snow, that the air was filling with dust and debris and the screams of my coworkers, that something unthinkably terrible was happening and I didn't understand what it was or why it was happening or whether I was going to survive it, whether anyone was going to survive it, whether the building was going to collapse completely and bury all of us under tons of concrete and steel and glass. My first thought, my only thought was Timothy. 3 floors below me in the daycare center, probably terrified by the noise and shaking, probably crying for his grandmother, probably clutching Peanut and wondering why the adults who were supposed to protect him couldn't make the scary sound stop, couldn't make the building stop shaking, couldn't explain what was happening in ways that would make sense to a 3-year-old mind that had never experienced anything like this, that had been taught to trust that grown-ups would always keep him safe, would always be able to fix whatever went wrong, would always be there when he needed them most. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was chaos beyond anything I had ever experienced or imagined, beyond anything that movies or television or books could have prepared me for. A complete breakdown of everything I thought I understood about how the world worked, how buildings stayed upright, how ordinary mornings proceeded in predictable ways from breakfast to lunch to dinner to bedtime, how children remained safe in daycare centers while their grandmothers worked in offices 3 floors above them, how life continued in straight lines rather than exploding into fragments that could never be reassembled into anything resembling what had existed just moments before. The north face of the building, the side facing the street where the truck bomb had been parked, had simply disappeared, had been blown away as if it had never existed, taking with it huge sections of the floors above, creating a gaping wound in the structure that exposed the interior offices to the sky, that turned desks and filing cabinets and water coolers into projectiles, that sent chunks of concrete and twisted metal and shattered glass flying through the air like deadly rain, that transformed a place of work and routine and ordinary human activity into a war zone, a disaster scene, a glimpse of hell that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. I was thrown to the floor by the force of the blast, my desk chair rolling away from me, my computer monitor falling and shattering, my carefully organized paperwork scattered like leaves in a hurricane, my 23 years of federal service reduced to debris in a matter of seconds, though, of course, the paperwork and the computer and even my job seemed completely irrelevant. When I realized that I couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in my ears, couldn't see anything except dust and smoke and chaos, couldn't think about anything except getting to Timothy, getting to the second floor, getting to the daycare center where my grandson was probably scared and hurt and calling for me, where he needed his grandmother to find him and comfort him and take him home where he would be safe, where this nightmare would end and we could return to our normal routine of pancakes and show and tell and bedtime stories. But when I tried to stand up, when I tried to make my way toward what I thought was the door to my office, I realized that the door was gone, that the hallway beyond it was gone, that the stairs I would normally have taken to reach the second floor were gone, that entire sections of the building had simply vanished, had been vaporized by the explosion, had taken with them the routes I would have used to reach Timothy, the pathways that connected my world to his world, the physical structure that had allowed me to work 3 floors above him, while remaining confident that I could reach him if he needed me, that I could protect him if anything went wrong, that I could keep my promise to see him at lunchtime. The realization that I might not be able to reach Timothy, that the explosion might have hurt him, that he might be trapped or injured or worse, filled me with a panic unlike anything I had ever experienced, a terror so complete and overwhelming that it made my injuries seem insignificant, my own survival seem unimportant, my own pain seem irrelevant compared to the possibility that my grandson was suffering somewhere below me, that he was calling for me and I couldn't get to him, that he was experiencing the kind of fear and confusion and physical trauma that no 3-year-old should ever have to endure, that I had failed in my most basic responsibility as his caregiver, his protector, his grandmother who had promised to always keep him safe. Other survivors were moving around me in the wreckage of what had been the 5th floor, people I had worked with for years who were now covered in dust and blood, who were helping each other navigate the debris, who were calling out names of co-workers and friends, who were trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to figure out how to escape from a building that no longer had normal exits, normal stairs, normal hallways, normal anything that could guide us toward safety, toward the outside world, toward help and medical attention, and answers to the questions that were racing through our minds as we struggled to understand how our ordinary Wednesday morning had become this. nightmare of destruction and death and desperation. I heard someone shouting that we needed to evacuate immediately, that the building might collapse further, that we needed to find a way out before the remaining structure gave way and buried us all. But I couldn't leave, couldn't abandon Timothy, couldn't save myself while my grandson was somewhere in the wreckage below me, possibly injured, possibly trapped, possibly calling for his grandmother, who had promised to take care of him, who had sworn to protect him, who had made him the center of her world and couldn't imagine a world without him in it, couldn't conceive of surviving if he didn't survive, couldn't accept that I might have to choose between my own safety and my desperate need to reach him, to find him, to hold him and tell him everything was going to be okay, even if I wasn't sure it was true. A co-worker named Janet Martinez grabbed my arm and told me we had to go, had to leave immediately, that the rescue workers would find the children, would get to the daycare center, would do everything possible to save anyone who could be saved, but that we couldn't help by staying in a building that was on the verge of complete collapse, that was filled with gas leaks and electrical hazards and structural damage that made every moment we remained inside a risk not just to ourselves, but to the rescue workers who would eventually have to come looking for us if we didn't get out while we still could. Janet's face was covered in blood from a cut on her forehead. Her clothes were torn and dusty, but her voice was steady and rational and convinced me that she was right, that staying would accomplish nothing except possibly adding my name to the list of victims, possibly making Timothy an orphan as well as a bombing victim, possibly destroying any chance I had of being there for him if he survived, if he needed me, if he was going to require months or years of care and recovery and love to heal from whatever trauma he had experienced during those first terrible minutes after the explosion. The evacuation was a nightmare of smoke and debris and human suffering, a journey through what had been familiar hallways and was now an obstacle course of fallen ceiling tiles and broken glass and twisted metal, a desperate scramble over piles of concrete and around gaping holes in the floor, a race against time and structural collapse and the possibility that we might not make it out alive, that we might join the growing list of people who had come to work that morning expecting another routine day and had instead encountered the kind of violence and destruction that changes everything forever. That marks the end of one life and the beginning of another, that divides existence into before and after with such sharp clarity that you can never again take safety for granted, never again assume that buildings will remain standing, never again believe that ordinary mornings will proceed in predictable ways from beginning to end. When I finally made it outside, when I finally reached the street and could see the full extent of the destruction, when I could comprehend the scale of what had happened to the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, I understood for the first time that this wasn't just an accident or a gas explosion or some kind of structural failure, but an intentional act of violence, a bomb, a terrorist attack that had been planned and executed by someone who wanted to kill as many people as possible, who had chosen a federal building specifically because it represented the government they hated, who had timed the explosion for maximum casualties, who had known that children would be in the daycare center, that innocent people would be at their desks, that families would be destroyed and communities would be shattered, and lives would be lost for the sake of making some twisted political statement that could never justify the enormous human cost, the immeasurable suffering, the permanent damage to everyone who survived and everyone who loved someone who didn't. The entire north face of the building was gone, simply erased, exposing the interior floors like a dollhouse that had been split open, revealing desks and chairs and filing cabinets hanging precariously over empty space, showing the skeletal remains of what had been offices and conference rooms and break areas where people had been working just minutes before, where they had been thinking about lunch plans and weekend activities and family responsibilities and all the ordinary concerns that make up daily life, never imagining that they were about to become victims of domestic terrorism, that their routine Wednesday morning was about to become part of American history, that their names would be read at memorial services and inscribed on monuments and remembered by strangers who would never know them personally but would understand that they died simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because someone else's hatred had chosen their workplace as a target, their lives as acceptable casualties in a war they didn't even know they were part of. Emergency vehicles were arriving from every direction. Ambulances and fire trucks and police cars, rescue workers who were already organizing search and recovery efforts, medical personnel who were setting up triage areas to treat the wounded, officials who were trying to establish security perimeters and coordinate the massive response that would be required to deal with this unprecedented disaster. This attack on American soil, this assault on the safety and security that we had all taken for granted until 9:02 that morning, when everything changed forever. When terrorism stopped being something that happened in other countries to other people and became something that could happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone, including federal employees and daycare children and grandmothers who thought they were living quiet, safe, predictable lives in the heart of America. I tried to get close to the building, tried to reach the area where the daycare center had been, but the rescue workers wouldn't let civilians near the wreckage, wouldn't allow untrained people to interfere with the search and rescue operations, wouldn't risk having more casualties among people who were trying to help, but lacked the expertise and equipment necessary to navigate the dangerous, unstable ruins of what had been a modern office building just hours before. They assured me that finding and rescuing the children was their top priority, that teams were already working to reach the daycare center, that everything humanly possible was being done to save anyone who might have survived. But their voices were gentle and careful in ways that suggested they understood how slim the chances were, how much devastation the explosion had caused, how unlikely it was that anyone on the second floor had survived the direct impact of a bomb that had been designed to bring down the entire structure. The waiting began then, the terrible, endless waiting that would define the next several days of my life, the desperate hope that would gradually transform into devastating certainty, the prayers that would eventually become grief, the bargaining with God and the universe and anyone who might be listening that would ultimately give way to the horrible realization that no amount of hope or prayer or desperate love could change what had happened in that building, could undo the destruction, could bring back the people who had been lost, could return my Timothy to me alive and whole and ready for lunch and afternoon stories and evening baths and all the ordinary miracles that make up a child's daily life, that I had been taking for granted until they were no longer possible, until they existed only in memory and dreams and the permanent ache of loss that would become my constant companion for whatever years remained ahead of me. The rescue efforts continued around the clock, with teams of workers and dogs and sophisticated equipment searching through the wreckage, looking for survivors, hoping to find people who had somehow managed to survive in pockets of space that had remained intact, air bubbles that had provided protection from the collapse, areas where the debris had fallen in ways that created temporary shelters rather than deadly traps. The media coverage was constant and overwhelming, with reporters from around the world documenting every aspect of the rescue efforts, interviewing survivors and family members and officials, trying to understand how something like this could happen in Oklahoma City, why anyone would want to attack a federal building, who could be responsible for such a devastating act of domestic terrorism that had killed so many innocent people, including children, including babies, including a 3-year-old boy named Timothy James Morrison, who had been excited about show and tell that morning, who had brought his favorite stuffed elephant to share with his classmates, who had kissed his grandmother goodbye and promised to tell her all about his day when she came down for lunch. The hours stretched into days, and the days brought only more heartbreak, more confirmation of deaths, more families receiving the news that no parent or grandparent should ever have to hear, more names added to the growing list of victims, more evidence that the explosion had been even more devastating than anyone had initially realized, that the chances of finding survivors were diminishing with each passing hour. That hope was becoming a luxury that the rescue workers could no longer afford to offer to the families who were waiting for news, who were clinging to possibilities that became more remote with every update, every briefing, every gentle suggestion that we should prepare ourselves for the worst while continuing to hope for the best. On the third day after the bombing, a rescue worker found Timothy's body in what remained of the America's Kids Daycare Center, crushed under concrete and debris, still clutching Peanut, his beloved elephant, the stuffed animal that was supposed to keep him safe and brave and comfortable in scary situations, that had traveled with him from his mother's house to my house, and finally to this place where no amount of love or security or careful planning could protect him from the hatred of strangers, from the violence of extremists, from the random cruelty that can destroy innocent lives without warning, without reason, without any consideration for the dreams and plans and futures that are lost when children die, when families are shattered, when communities are forced to confront the reality that nowhere is completely safe, that evil can strike anywhere, anytime, and that all our efforts to protect the people we love are ultimately fragile and inadequate against the forces of destruction that exist in this world. The identification process was formal and heartbreaking, requiring me to confirm that the small, broken body they had recovered from the wreckage was indeed my grandson, the little boy I had raised for 8 months, who had filled my house with laughter and my days with purpose, who had made me feel useful and needed and grateful for the privilege of being his primary caregiver, his most constant source of love and stability. His grandmother who had promised to always keep him safe and had failed in the most fundamental way possible, who had brought him to the very place where he would die, who had kissed him goodbye and left him in what I thought was the safest possible environment, never imagining that federal buildings could be targets, that daycare centers could become crime scenes, that 3-year-old children could become victims of political violence. The funeral was held a week after the bombing, in a small church that was packed with family and friends and co-workers and complete strangers who had been touched by Timothy's story, who understood that he represented all the innocent victims of that terrible day, all the children whose lives had been cut short by someone else's hatred, all the futures that had been stolen by an act of domestic terrorism that accomplished nothing except destruction and pain, and the kind of grief that changes families forever, that leaves permanent holes in the fabric of communities, that reminds us how precious and fragile life is, how quickly everything we love can be taken away, how important it is to appreciate every ordinary moment we're given with the people who matter most to us. I spoke at Timothy's funeral, though I'm not sure how I found the strength or the words to stand in front of all those people and talk about my grandson, about his personality and his dreams and his love for animals and art and music, about the way he had transformed my life from something that felt finished and empty after Robert's death into something that felt meaningful and necessary and full of love and purpose and hope for the future. I talked about his excitement that morning, about his show and tell presentation, about Peanut and the way Timothy had practiced explaining why his elephant was special, about the breakfast we had shared and the lunch we would never have, about the bedtime story I would never get to read and the goodnight kiss I would never get to give, about all the tomorrows that had been stolen from us by someone who thought his political beliefs were more important than the lives of innocent people, including children, including babies, including my beautiful, perfect, irreplaceable grandson. The grief that followed Timothy's death was different from the grief I had experienced when Robert died, not because I loved one more than the other, but because losing a child, even a grandchild who had been in my care for only 8 months, violates something fundamental about the natural order of things, about the way life is supposed to work, about the assumption that children outlive grandparents, that the young bury the old, that generations pass the torch rather than having it extinguished by violence, by hatred, by the deliberate actions of people who choose destruction over creation, death over life, terror over peace, fear over love. Robert's death, while devastating, had made sense in the context of a life fully lived. 73 years of marriage and work and friendship and accomplishment, 73 years of birthdays and anniversaries and holidays and all the ordinary days that add up to a complete existence, even if that existence ended too soon, even if I wasn't ready to let him go, even if I had hoped for more years together, more time to travel and enjoy retirement and watch our grandchildren grow up and become the amazing people we knew they could become. But Timothy's death made no sense at all, violated every assumption about fairness and justice and the basic protection that society owes to its most vulnerable members, the children who depend on adults to create safe environments, to make good decisions, to build a world where 3-year-olds can go to daycare without being murdered by domestic terrorists, where show and tell is the biggest worry of the day, where stuffed elephants provide adequate comfort for any scary situation a child might encounter. The aftermath of the bombing brought an outpouring of support from around the world, letters and flowers and donations from people who had never been to Oklahoma City, but who understood that what happened here could happen anywhere, that the victims could have been their children or grandchildren or co-workers or friends, that the line between observer and victim is thinner than anyone wants to believe, that all of us are vulnerable to the kind of random violence that can turn an ordinary morning into a national tragedy, that can transform routine activities into historical events, that can make private grief into public mourning, that can turn individual families into symbols of something larger and more complex than any one person's loss, any one family's devastation, any one community's struggle to understand and heal and move forward. The trial of Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols provided some answers about who was responsible for the bombing and why they had chosen to commit this act of terrorism. But no amount of explanation could make sense of the decision to murder children, to target a building that housed a daycare center, to prioritize political statement over human life, to choose violence as a response to disagreement with government policies, to believe that killing innocent people would somehow advance their cause or change anyone's mind about anything except their own capacity for evil, their own willingness to sacrifice other people's lives for their own twisted version of patriotism, their own definition of what it means to be American, their own understanding of what kinds of actions are acceptable in a civilized society. Watching McVeigh during the trial, seeing his face and hearing his voice and listening to his explanations for why he had decided to build a bomb and park it in front of a federal building during business hours when he knew that hundreds of people would be inside, when he knew that children would be in the daycare center, when he knew that his actions would kill and maim and destroy innocent lives, provided no comfort, no sense of justice, no feeling that his conviction and eventual execution would somehow balance the scales or bring back the people he had murdered or heal the wounds he had inflicted on families and communities, and the entire nation's sense of security and safety. Justice, I learned, is not the same thing as healing, and punishment is not the same thing as resolution. And knowing who was responsible doesn't necessarily make the loss any easier to bear, or the grief any less overwhelming, or the questions any less haunting about how to continue living in a world where such things are possible, where hatred can motivate people to commit acts of unthinkable violence, where children can die for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, where grandmothers can lose grandsons to domestic terrorism, where show and tell can become the last happy moment of a 3-year-old's life, where stuffed elephants can't provide protection against truck bombs, where love and care and attention can't guarantee safety, where all our efforts to create secure environments for the people we cherish are ultimately no match for the destructive power of human evil. The Oklahoma City National Memorial was built on the site of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a beautiful and moving tribute to the victims and survivors and rescue workers and everyone who was touched by the bombing, a place where families could come to remember and grieve and heal, where the community could gather to commemorate the anniversary and honor the memory of those who were lost, where visitors from around the world could learn about what happened and why it matters, and how ordinary people responded with extraordinary courage and compassion and resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy, how communities can come together after being torn apart, how hope can survive even in the darkest circumstances, how love can persist even when the people who inspired it are gone. Timothy's name is inscribed on one of the chairs in the field of empty chairs, a small chair because he was only 3 years old, positioned among the other children's chairs in a section that represents the America's Kids Daycare Center, a permanent reminder that he existed, that he mattered, that his life had value even though it was so brief, that his death was a loss not just to our family, but to the entire community, to everyone who understands that when children die, we all lose something precious and irreplaceable, some sense of innocence and safety and trust in the basic goodness of the world, some faith in our ability to protect the most vulnerable members of our society from harm. I visit the memorial several times a year, always on Timothy's birthday and the anniversary of the bombing, sometimes just when I need to feel close to him, when I need to sit quietly in that peaceful place and remember not just his death, but his life, not just the way he died, but the way he lived, the joy he brought to every day, the laughter that filled my house, the love that gave my retirement years meaning and purpose, the hope he represented for the future, for the next generation, for all the good things he might have accomplished if he had been allowed to grow up, to become the person he was meant to be, to contribute to the world in ways that would have honored his gentle spirit, his loving heart, his natural compassion for people and animals and anyone who needed help or comfort or care. Sometimes other families are there when I visit, other people who lost loved ones in the bombing, other survivors who are still processing their own trauma and grief, other community members who want to pay their respects and remember what happened and ensure that the victims are not forgotten, that their stories continue to be told, that their deaths continue to mean something more than just statistics in a history book, more than just names on a memorial wall, more than just another example of domestic terrorism in America, another tragedy that happened to other people in another place at another time, as if distance or time could somehow diminish the reality of the loss, the permanence of the grief, the ongoing impact on everyone who loved someone who died that day. The conversations I have with other families at the memorial are some of the most meaningful interactions in my life now. Connections with people who understand exactly what it feels like to lose someone to violence, to have your life divided into before and after, To carry grief that is so profound and permanent that it becomes part of your identity, part of how you move through the world, part of how you relate to other people and understand your place in the larger story of human experience, human suffering, human resilience, human love that persists even when the people who inspired it are gone, even when the circumstances of their death make no sense, even when the questions about why and how and what if will never have satisfactory answers. These conversations have taught me that grief is not something you recover from like an illness or overcome like an obstacle, but something you learn to carry, something that becomes integrated into your daily life, something that changes you forever but doesn't have to destroy you, doesn't have to prevent you from finding meaning and purpose and even happiness in the years that remain, doesn't have to define you entirely, even though it will always be part of you, part of your story, part of what makes you who you are and how you understand the world and what you believe about love and loss and the preciousness of every ordinary moment we're given with the people who matter most to us. In the 28 years since the bombing, I have learned to measure time differently, not in the linear progression of days and weeks and months that once seemed so important, but in the deeper rhythms of seasons and anniversaries, in the gradual accumulation of experiences that are shaped by Timothy's absence but not defined entirely by it, in the slow development of a new kind of normal that includes his death but also includes love and memory and the ongoing relationship I have with his spirit, his legacy, the parts of him that continue to exist in my heart and in the stories I tell about him, and in the ways his brief life continues to influence how I live my own life, how I treat other people, how I understand what really matters and what doesn't, what deserves my attention and energy and what is simply noise and distraction and temporary concern. I have learned that you can love someone completely and miss them desperately, and also find ways to be grateful for the time you had together, that grief and gratitude can coexist in the same heart, in the same moment, in the same breath, that honoring the dead doesn't require the living to stop living, but instead requires us to live more fully, more intentionally, more aware of the gift of each day, each relationship, each opportunity to make a positive difference in someone else's life, to create something beautiful, to offer comfort to someone who is suffering, to contribute to the healing of a world that contains both unimaginable cruelty and extraordinary compassion, both devastating loss and remarkable love. I have learned that Timothy's death, while the most heartbreaking thing that ever happened to me, is not the only thing that defines me. That I am more than just the grandmother of a bombing victim. That my life has value and meaning beyond the tragedy that brought it to national attention. That I can be proud of the months I spent caring for Timothy, and also proud of the woman I have become in the years since his death. The woman who has found ways to help other families facing similar losses. The woman who has discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The woman who has learned to carry grief like a sacred responsibility rather than a burden, like a way of keeping Timothy's memory alive and present in the world rather than buried with his body, like a bridge between the life we had together and the life I continue to live in his honor, in his memory, with his love still guiding my choices and my priorities and my understanding of what it means to be human in a world that can be both beautiful and terrible, both cruel and kind, both heartbreaking and hope-filled, depending on where you look and how you choose to respond to the circumstances you cannot control, the losses you cannot prevent, the love you cannot lose even when the people who inspired it are gone. If you are watching this because you have lost someone you love to violence, because you understand the particular pain of sudden, senseless loss, because you know what it means to have your life divided into before and after by someone else's hatred, by circumstances beyond your control, by events that make no sense and never will make sense no matter how much time passes, or how many explanations you receive, or how much support you get from people who care about you. I want you to know that you are not alone, that your grief is valid and important and permanent, that finding ways to honor your loved one's memory while also honoring your own need to continue living is not betrayal, but the highest form of tribute you can offer. The greatest gift you can give to someone whose time was cut short but whose impact on your life will last forever. And if you are watching this because you are living in a world where domestic terrorism continues to threaten innocent people, where hatred motivates violence, where children are not safe even in places that should be sanctuaries, where ordinary activities can become targets for extremists who believe their political beliefs justify murder, I want you to know that love is stronger than hate, that community is more powerful than isolation, that the human capacity for compassion and resilience and healing will always outweigh the human capacity for destruction, even when it doesn't feel that way, even when the news is filled with stories of violence and division, even when it seems like the world is becoming more dangerous rather than safer, more cruel rather than kind, more hopeless rather than hopeful. The breakfast I made for Timothy that morning, the pancakes cut into dinosaur shapes that made him giggle and clap his hands, will always be the last meal we shared, the last normal moment in our old life. The last time I took for granted that he would come home to me at the end of the day, that he would tell me about his show and tell presentation, that he would help me make dinner and play with his toys and take his bath and listen to his bedtime story and kiss me goodnight and promise to see me in the morning, ready for another day of being 3 years old and full of wonder and curiosity and trust and love and all the qualities that make children so precious, so worthy of protection, so deserving of the chance to grow up and become the amazing people they are meant to be, if we can just keep them safe long enough. If we can just create a world where hatred doesn't win, where violence doesn't triumph, where love gets the last word even when evil seems to have all the power, even when terrorists think they can destroy our communities and our families and our faith in each other, even when it feels like the darkness is winning and the light is failing, and hope is nothing more than a naive dream that can't survive in the real world where bombs explode and children die and grandmothers learn to live with grief that will never fully heal, with questions that will never be answered, with love that has nowhere to go except into memory and into the ongoing commitment to make sure that Timothy's life mattered, that his death was not meaningless, that his story continues to be told and his spirit continues to inspire people to choose love over hate, peace over violence, hope over despair, life over death, even when those choices are difficult, even when they require courage we're not sure we possess, even when they demand faith in a future we can't see but must believe in anyway, for Timothy's sake, for the sake of all the children who deserve better than the world we've given them, for the sake of love itself, which is the only force strong enough to heal what hatred has broken, to build what violence has destroyed, to create what fear has prevented, to believe what despair has denied, to hope what grief has abandoned, to trust what betrayal has shattered, to love what loss has taken away,